Welcome to the African News Review podcast, where we cut through the noise and get to the truth. I am your host, Adesoji Iginla, and each week we are here to challenge the biases, prejudices, and misinformation in the Western press about Africa. Using historical context and contemporary insights, we set the record straight and reclaim the narrative. Tune in every Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern as we uncover the real stories and reshape the conversations about Africa. This is the African News Review podcast, reclaiming Africa's narrative, one story at a time. Yes, greetings and welcome to African News Review. But this week, it's going to be much more than a review. It's going to be a book review. It's going to be a book review on Neo-Colonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism. And before we dive into, yes, I see you've got your copy there.
Yes,
Before
sir.
we dive into it, we do normal protocol, which is introduce myself. I am Adesoji Iginla. And with me, as usual, is none other than the legend that is Comrade Milton Allimadi, the author of this here book, one of which we'll also do a review at some point of how manufacturing hate, how Africa was demonized in Western media. So, Brother Milton, your initial thoughts. How was the week and how are you generally?
Oh, the week is fine. I mean, people are overly stressed by the unpredictable behavior of the United States president. But I tell my friends that, the world has been around for a long time, you see? And the world will continue to be around after Donald Trump. So just remember that.
Yes.
Dress yourself accordingly.
Mm-hmm.
And, we as African people, we've survived everything. And we are still there. And at the end of the day, we are the ones that are going to set the world once again in the correct direction. All humanity sprang from Africa, and all solutions ultimately will come again from Africa. Don't be intimidated by the power, the technology, and all that stuff, At the end of the day, human beings are what matter.
Okay, speaking of people that matter, this book, Kwame Nkrumah, Neo-Colonialism, Last Stage of Imperialism. I'll first of all give just a brief overview of what the book is about. I will not go in-depth into the author's bio because that said, he is a popular name around the historical circles with regards to Africa. Neo-Colonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism. This book was first published in 1965. It's subsequently been republished time and time again because there is a constant need for this book to all the issues addressed in this book to be placed not just in a historical context but also in contemporary ones. It's 18 chapters, and the 18 chapters breaks down neocolonialism to the point where it got the powers that be worried. I'll just give you an example. I'll share my screen here. There was a memo that was shared by the CIA director internally. And the memo reads, book review. It was titled, it was approved for release, so it's not like I've hacked their system or anything.
Mm-hmm.
So it was memo for Deputy Director of Central Intelligence, book review, Neo-Colonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism. And it goes in depth as to why this book is incendiary in its parts. It goes in. The memoranda is for information to call your attention to the just published book, Neo-Colonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism by Kwame Nkrumah. The book is published, like I said, by Thomas Nelson and Sons, 1965. It is this edition which is also utilized in Accra, Ghana. Nkrumah's thesis is stated in its introduction as follows. The essence of neocolonialism is that the state which is subject to it, in fury and independent, and has all outward trappings of international sovereignty, in reality, its economic system and thus its political policy is directed from outside. would you want to go into your thoughts, your initial thoughts, based on that introduction alone?
No, I mean, that captures it. I mean, that's why they started with that. And that remains the same. I mean, I've always said in many of our conversations that there's not a single independent African country today. The closest one was Libya, which of course has now been destroyed by NATO and the United States since the 2010 invasion, because you cannot be independent if you do not control
your borders,
your production. If you can't decide what to produce for your economy, if you don't control your finance, then how can you say you're really independent? Independence was not meant for Africans to replace Europeans in the same position. That's a complete lie. It was not meant for Nkrumah to become prime minister and then president in order to replace a European governor. That's not what independence was for. Independence was to reclaim what had been taken away, which was Africa's control over its destiny. Africans controlled what they used to produce before independence, before colonialism. They controlled whom they traded with, and they had their own currencies, whether it was a few countries like Ethiopia that had, minted currency, whether it was other products, including cowrie shells at one point, whether it was by direct barter. But they control. Remember, even if you go back at the old history books, right? When they were trading gold for salt. Now, when you look back, to somebody looking back without evaluating, it will look nonsensical. How would somebody trade gold for salt?
Gold for salt.
But it's based on quantity, right? If you have no salt, abundance of gold, and they have no gold but abundance of salt, of course you would trade gold for salt because you have a lot. But the important point I'm making is that Africans were evaluating and determining the exchange rate by themselves. Today, Ghana
does
not set the price of the cocoa that it produces and sells. It responds to something they call world market. What is this world market? It is how much the companies that produce chocolate want to buy the cocoa for. This is one example. Use that for every product that Africa exports to the outside world. Africans are not the ones who set the price. The only Africans involved in a situation where they have some control in setting price are the African countries that are members of OPEC. Even that is not individual, it's collectively. OPEC, the petroleum producing countries, they meet together, they determine how much they're going to produce. So, of course, that constricts the availability of the resources and it dictates the price. But apart from that, there's no other example where an African country is in control of its own production and the price which it receives for what it sells. So why are they calling themselves independent? I mean, does an American manufacturer produce a car and then an African country tells them, okay, this is what I'm going to buy the Ford vehicle for? They would lock you up in a mental hospital, right? Does an African country tell the Japanese car manufacturer, this is how much I'm going to buy the car for? Do they tell that to British companies that produce vehicles? Of course not. Do they tell that to the industrial countries that produce pharmaceuticals? Of course not. In fact, they would not even give you pharmaceuticals during the AIDS pandemic, during the COVID pandemic.
AIDS pandemic, yeah. Yes.
Countries that are independent in the world, but they are not African countries. These countries are not African countries. So, of course, I agree with Nkrumah wholeheartedly. And in fact, the level of control of African countries, as you know, has become even much more intense since Nkrumah wrote those words.
Okay. So he described the system of neocolonialism. Could you explain in terms of, there is often this clamor around the world to say one was much more magnanimous than the other. be it the Portuguese, the French, the Brits, the Spanish to a certain extent, and even the Germans, again to a certain extent. Was there a difference in terms of what we see to be neocolonial ventures when it came to the issue of Africa? Just taking a quick break here on the African News Review podcast, but don't go anywhere. If you're enjoying our deep dive into the real stories behind the headlines, make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Every Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern, we're here to debunk the myths and bring you the truth about Africa. Want to help spread the word? Share this podcast with your friends and leave us a review. It goes a long way in helping others discover the real Africa. Without further ado, let's get back to setting the record straight.
No, they're on the same page. They all use the same institutions.
Playbook.
Today, the institutions is what they call, so-called foreign aid. It is the World Bank, and it's the IMF. So I don't know if there's a single African country whose economy is not maintained, not just subsidized, because in some cases it's 50%. 50% of your budget comes from the World Bank, or so-called, and I like the terms they use, they call it development partners. What kind of partnership, when everything is dictated from, see the semantics also, they call it foreign aid. Foreign aid, let's start with foreign aid. What is the purpose of foreign aid? If it's supposed to help you develop, then how come you're not yet developed? That should tell you that you should stop accepting these terminologies just blindly. Think about what the terminologies are designed to do. So, okay, African countries have been receiving funding from the World Bank since Nkrumah got money for the Volta River project, which was constructed, as you know, inaugurated in 1966, just before he was overthrown. So, how come there's not a single economically developed African country today when you've been getting resources from the World Bank since 1966? So that should tell you, or are you telling me that the World Bank does not know how to develop economies? Could that really be true? Think about it.
That's a huge indictment.
Is that the failure of Africa or the failure of the World Bank? Or better, is the World Bank successful in what they are trying to accomplish in Africa? And the answer is much likely this one, the latter. Otherwise, they would not continue shipping billions of dollars in funding to African countries. Only an irrational lunatic would do something like that. You only do that if it's accomplishing the mission. And since Africa does not have a single developed modern economy, it means their purpose is to prevent you from developing a modern economy, independent economy in Africa. Sometimes we have to think logically and ask ourselves these questions. They're very simple. Why would somebody, can I come to you and keep giving you money on a regular basis, you, Adesoji, and I see your condition is not really changing dramatically, and yet I keep giving you money? Think about that. Then you have to explore, why could Milton be doing that? What is his true motive and agenda, So they use the same mechanism. They give you that loan. They prevent you from manufacturing. It's not by accident that Ghana has been selling cocoa for decades, right? And producing cocoa. Other countries producing tea, producing coffee, producing cotton. Even when you produce copper, it is not used to manufacture products. You sell it raw. Same thing with uranium, coltan, cobalt, you name it, any product, gold, diamond. Gold, you're not shaping it into bullions, right? Diamond, you're not cutting it into fine rings or other jewelry. You're selling those huge rocks, and they make money when they hire people to cut it and polish it. And that's not done in Africa. It's only Botswana that has started doing that now. So really,
The
we are not
cutting of
really
diamonds, yeah.
independent. If we were independent, the income level would be much, much higher in African countries because all the work that is being, we're subsidizing jobs in the industrialized countries. When we sell them the resources for cheap in its raw form, they put it into use in factories and they hire people who are paid much, much higher salary to come up with what they call the finished product. So we are the ones who are subsidizing Europe, the United States, Japan, China. We're the ones who are giving them foreign aid, but it's disguised.
As aid. Okay, so I mean, now we establish what their motives are. Why is it that, I mean, this is another neo-colonial angle. Why is it that the world press has not caught on to this to say
To it.
you're exploiting?
But who controls it? They're caught onto it. They're part of the establishment. I mean, listen, one of the earliest editorials that I remember in the New York Times about Africa is from 1877. I think it's July, I forget the date, but sometime July 1877. And the headline is just simple, Africa. And the headline, so they have always done propaganda to legitimate and justify exploitation. Right? So that was before European colonization of Africa, 1877, a few years before the Berlin Conference, which was, of course, as you know, 1884, 85. So editorial, they were already competing. At that time, Germany was a rising power. Germany competing with England for territorial ambition. So the editorial said, first it described, they didn't even pretend, 100% outright demonization, telling its readers that Africans are somehow related to hippopotami and crocodile. They're mixed between, But at the same time, they have some level of humanity, Think a little bit like humans. So that's why they're very tortured. Animal, not half, but a part of them had human sentiments as well. So the way to uplift them and bring them into the community of human beings, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, is for England to go and colonize Africa.
Okay.
So they have started 1877, they're already doing that job. So, of course, they would not use that kind of language today. They're much more sophisticated, but their purpose is still the same. When they talk about, for example, you can Google and put New York Times and put that poor, and you will see all these articles in the New York Times describing particular African countries as that poor countries. If there's a that poor country, what are the French companies doing there? If it's a that poor country, what are the American companies doing there? What are the Japanese companies doing there? What is China doing there? If these are quote unquote that poor countries. So the media, they do their part to disassociate Africa from the rest of the normal human family, right? They will always need us to go and quote unquote help. And how do they help? They come there and they take our resources for cheap. So the media, particularly Western media, they're not going to be our allies in liberation. That's why we need our own independent media. We need to have these types of spaces where we have this type of conversation. How can a country like Niger, to use the New York Times' own words, be, quote unquote, so that poor when all the uranium that uplifts the income of France comes from Niger?
France.
How does that make sense? It means Niger is not getting paid what it deserves. If it's only getting a fraction of what they should be getting, the income would be so much higher. But it shows you they're getting an infinitesimally small amount for the uranium. And that's why when they had the coup 2 years ago, the French kept insisting, no, you got to put that guy back in power. The Democratic democratically elected. Since when does France care about democracy in Africa? They wanted him back because he was not rocking the boat and saying, you need to pay us more for the uranium. Now you notice that's what the new government is saying. You want uranium, you got to pay for it, or you're not going to be getting it. And now they're talking collectively, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali, so that France can't run to the other and say, give me a better deal, run to the other. So Africans should actually learn from these three countries. And it goes all the way back to Nkrumah. Had African countries united and formed the United States of Africa, we will not be having this conversation, because they will be getting the fair price for all of the products that come from Africa, whether it's mineral resources, natural resources, or agricultural resources, or even our talented Africans would be paid the proper wages, you know?
So we know the media is on the side of capital, as it's come to be known. What does capital look like when it comes into the African continent in terms of its neo-colonial intentions?
Okay, very good question. And I recommend there's also a brief video called Africa's Industrialization Challenge on YouTube. It's by Samir Amin. And Samir Amin says, you know, they talk to African countries that you need to have a free movement of capital, no capital restrictions. And that you, African countries, you're not getting capital because you have too much regulations, too many regulations, right? That's the problem. And he points out that that is complete nonsense. He says China has the most regulations relative to other countries, including all African countries. Yet, compared to the capital that goes to China, compared to what comes to Africa, Africa gets literally zero.
Zero, yeah.
Absolutely. So that's not the case. What they want is no regulation in Africa so that they invest in these fly-by-night operations. You come there, you make your money almost instantly, and then you're out of there. He says, and you can't develop like that. But when you go to China, China is going to say, okay, number one, which industry are you investing in? Then you decide, okay. Then they'll give you conditions. The investment needs to be a minimum of X years. So once you have that guarantee, you can plan, right? It's like me coming to you and saying, I'm going to give you funding. I'm going to give you X amount, and it's going to last for 10 years. 10 years. And then maybe I'll start talking exit plan at that time. Now you, knowing the money, the investment is secured in your account.
For 10 years.
For 10 years, you can plan, right? You can now plan. Say, I can, use this amount for this, use this amount for this, invest this amount in something else so that I'm able to repay, Milton at some point in the future. But if I say no regulations, I just come and say, okay, today I want to put this amount in it. And then tomorrow, maybe I see I have a little profit from that. Okay, boom, I pull it all out. You are left immediately with nothing. And you already had started planning. You're saying, oh, next week I'm going to buy this, that, and that, and that, and that. You can't even do that because the money's gone.
The money's gone.
Exactly. So I'm oversimplifying. But that's the type of situation that most African countries have. You see? They can't make long-term planning projections because they don't have long-term investment. But once again, it comes back to what Nkrumah said. You have to unite, because I come to you and I say, these are my terms. And you said, no, this can't help me. I won't be able to plan. I won't be able to develop. I have a 5-year development plan for my country, 10-year development plan. But you're telling me you could take the money out tomorrow. How can I do it like that? You're not willing to do that? Your friend's name, what's his name? James? Okay, let me talk to James. James agrees on those conditions. Boom, you're gone. And that's what I meant by saying you need to be on the same page. So we'll have to deal with Adesoji because I know James is going to be giving me the same conditions. So I deal with you, or I deal with James. But on the good terms that you yourself, you're setting.
I've agreed
You
to.
see?
Yeah.
So basically, to use a less generous word, it is economic rape of Africa. That is what's happening. It's economic rape.
And it's
It's continued. It never ended, unfortunately.
now, we've spoken about the use of the lack of sovereignty, lack of industrialization, the role of
Yep.
media. We've also talked about capital. One thing that I find is when you're mentioning the issue of capital, which is in terms of price and what have you, why is it that, although maybe I'm going to answer my own question, why is it that Africa has not been able to, in the so-called, following on from the so-called year of independence, 1960s, up till now, have a common currency like Europe does? Instead, we've tied ourselves to the almighty dollar.
Well, I guess the
Because
best answer is
one of the chapters here, it says monopoly capitalism and the US dollar, which
right.
is chapter 4 in the book. So he goes in depth into tying the fact that that dollar is almost a signifier to show Africa's helplessness, because your currency is constantly being devalued against the US dollar, wherein you stand no chance individually, but if you come collectively, you might. But for some reason, we've not been able to come to terms with that aspect of it. Why is that
Well,
the case?
there are a number of answers. I think the simplest one would be look at the people who have been governing African states. So that's very important as well. Study every African country. Look at the individual who have been either prime ministers or who have been presidents of each and every one of these African countries. And that would provide you a very good answer. Have those leaders set this as their number one priority? And I think generally the answer is no. And then when it comes to the dollar itself, it was not always the dollar. If you remember, it was the British pound sterling.
British
In
pound,
the past, when you said British pound sterling, people would lift their chest up like that. It was only after World War II, when those European economies were completely destroyed, when Ghana was sending food to feed people in England because of the destruction of World War II. Their cities were in shambles. They had been reduced to what they like calling African countries today, so-called third world. That is what they had been reduced to. In fact, fourth world, because they were not producing. The food was being produced and brought from Africa, you see. So we were in maybe, I hate these terms, but if we are to use that term, we're in third world at that time. They were in fourth world at that moment. So the United States came with the Marshall
Plan
and gave them billions of dollars, not even a loan, grant, money they did not even have to pay back. So, of course, the dollar became the powerful currency, because now if you're buying parts for your product, your factories, to repair your factories, you're using American currency, right? You're buying products that you need to consume until you resume your own production, you're using American currency. So that is why the American dollar became universally supreme at that moment. And of course, our currencies are not even known, you see, because we were pegged to the colonial powers currency. The East African shilling was pegged to the British pound. In West Africa, they had the CFA, which is not even pegged, but was actually, you could say it's the same currency, right? Controlled directly by France.
From France. Yeah.
And then, of course, it's not that Africans don't know the importance of currency. Every African country has bright people in finance, right? They have the governors of the central bank. Governors of central bank know how currencies operate, and they know the importance of having a unified currency. If you look, it's not so much in the book, but for anybody who's listening right now, go to search speeches made by African leaders at the 1963 Organization of African Unity meeting. If you put that on Google, it's going to take you on a link on the website of the AU. and read all their speeches, and read Nkrumah's speech in particular, when he explained the importance of us creating our currency. It is that speech, in fact, which Muammar Gaddafi must have read much, much later, because he followed exactly how Nkrumah laid it out. Nkrumah said, if we want a powerful currency, let's link it not to the outside British or French. Let's link it to the resources we have, our natural resources. Remember, back in the day, currency used to be pegged to gold. Even the U.S. currency, the British currency, was pegged to gold, right? They had the gold standard. So, in other words, you could show up with that currency, and you'd be entitled to a certain quantity of gold. You see? But now you go into an era where it is free floating, meaning you can actually print money that is not really linked to anything except confidence, right? So because the U.S. is a superpower, you know, it has nuclear power, the largest economy in the world, at least up to now. So the U.S. dollar has power as legal tender anywhere in the world, but it's not backed by anything. It is not linked to gold like back in the day, you see? But it's linked to the name and reputation of the United States. But Nkrumah said we can do better. We have all these resources, so let's peg our African currency to resources. Gaddafi did the same. He tried to put that Nkrumah idea and to execute it and bring it to reality. As a result of that, Gaddafi is 6 feet under today. It is the main reason why the Europeans convinced the U.S. to join in this NATO attack, particularly France. France did not want an independent African currency linked to Libya's gold. Gaddafi already put aside estimated $7 to $10 billion to link this new African currency to. You see? And that would have completely destroyed the CFA franc and would have freed all those West African countries from French colonialism. And then their media, once again, going back to their media, the media said the reason they're going there, they're going into Libya, is to stop Gaddafi from, quote unquote, killing his own people, right? And how did they do it? By bombing Libya 24/7 for 10 months. To stop somebody from killing his own people, you come and you kill probably 100 times more than he allegedly was killing. So does that make sense to you? Could that really have been the true reason? Of course not. And that's the problem. Sometimes many of us, we don't think logically and say, wait, that can't be the true reason. Why are they bombing massively like this, killing so many people? You think bombs just fall there and nobody dies? Then why would they continue dropping it? They're dropping it with a purpose, of course. And there's no bomb smart enough. They say, oh, I'm just going to drop right on Gaddafi and not kill anybody else. You see? So they destroy that idea to put the African currency into realization. And that's the other answer. Many African leaders know that would be the solution. But who wants to end up like Gaddafi? For example,
it comes with a cost.
Congo could have one of the most powerful currencies in the world. If Congo says beginning January 1, 2026, next year, we're going to have the Congo, even call it the Congo, right? Our currency is going to be called the Congo. It is going to be linked to our cobalt, our coltan, our uranium. You put put the minerals aside that this currency is going to be linked to. Think about that. Who would want the British pound, or the French franc? If I could have the Congo, which is linked to real tangible resources, you see?
Materials. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, even
the same thing.
Even
it's when. Okay, thank you. You took the words out of my mouth. I was going to say.
Go on.
I was going to say it's the same thing that Sankara was saying. Sankara said, let's renounce the debt, but let's do it collectively. Otherwise, I will be dead before next year's OAU meeting. That was in July 87. October 87, he was dead. So I was going to say that if Tshisekedi in Congo wants to do it, he must say, Africa, let's peg our currencies collectively. If I, Chikedi, just come out with the Congo alone, I won't be around for long. And sure enough, he will not be around for long. He won't.
Of course.
When it comes to...
Now,
go ahead, sorry.
No, go on.
No, I was just going to say, when it comes to wealth, when it comes to living the good life, the European world are on the same page. If they see any African who seems like he would have the chance to convince other Africans to challenge that wealth supremacy, they will quickly eliminate that African. There's no debate about that. They're on the same page. It's not a coincidence that you have a genocidal killer like Museveni in Uganda in power for 40 years, 40, compared to a person like Patrice Lumumba, who comes there and starts talking about using Congo's resources for the Congolese, talks about helping liberate the African countries that were still under white minority rule. He was in office for 3 months. You have Kwame Nkrumah talking United States of Africa with our continental army, our continental currency, no passports, free movement of goods and resources. He's overthrown in 1966. Yep, we just spoke about Sankara saying Africa's market for Africa, right? Produce what you consume what you produce. He's in power. Produce your own food. In 3 years, they were no longer importing food. How long is he in power? 83 to 84, 85, 86, 87. 4 years.
4 years.
The person whom they imposed on Congo after they killed Patrice Lumumba, he is in power for 37 years while stealing $5 billion from the national treasury and depositing it in French and Swiss banks. You see?
Yep.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So we know colonialism exists. And why is it that most African countries have not reformed their educational system? Because
Thank you.
They do say a mind is a terrible thing to waste.
Thank you.
So if you clearly know certain things are the way they are, what you want to do is arm your population with information for critical thinking and to be able to,
No, thank you. I mean, the answer is very obvious. You yourself, you're already educated. You're already educated, and yet you're back in school, learning more because knowledge is not finite, right?
Yeah, correct.
I've been to school a long time. I'm back in school, right? In Uganda, let me give you another example from my home country. Guess who the Minister of Education is? The wife of the dictator. The wife of the dictator, Museveni, is the Minister of Education, right? I understand she was refused admission to the National University. But who dares refuse admission to the dictator's wife, right? So eventually she got in.
Yeah.
I understand that the academic work which led to her being awarded the degree was not done by her, right? But she's the Minister of Education today. Think about that. Do you think she will ever say, I want this book to be part of the national curriculum at every level? There are parts of this book that can be amended for primary schools. There's another part that can be amended for secondary schools. Then, of course, the ones in college would read this whole book
in its
entirety. Correct? Those are the kind of things that we need to do.
Yeah.
I doubt even in Ghana whether that has done, you see? But that's the power to transform society. Education is the power to transform society. Yeah, so you're correct.
I mean, when he was overthrown, the first thing they did was they destroyed most of his library, and his books were physically burnt. Because stuff like this is far too incendiary to put in the hands of people. Right. I'll go back to that CIA memo. There's a part there I want you to speak on, and it goes like, okay, for those who are just joining us, this letter was shared. This memo was shared between a member of staff in the CIA and sent to the CIA director based on this book we're reading, Neo-Colonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism. So it goes in detail. There's another part where he says, chapter 18, he says, the mechanism for neocolonialism, page 239 to 258, is the one which most caught the eye of the press and is of greatest interest to the CIA. Here, Nkrumah explains how the imperialist powers achieved their modern objective, which they formerly achieved by naked colonialism. The US, he says, is the worst offender in Nkrumah's opinion, utilizing the extended tentacles of Wall Street octopus, and its suction cups and muscular strength are provided by a phenomenon dubbed the invisible government, arising from the Wall Street connection with the Pentagon and various intelligence services. That's page 240. And it continues. Nkrumah then regales the reader with a quotation from the Wise and Ross, the invisible government, and cites them to the effect that the intelligence network employs over 200,000 people and spends billions of dollars a year. Nkrumah notes that the imperialist use of labor through various international labor organizations, including the African American Labor Center under the AFL chief George Meany, and well-known CIA man in labor top echelon Ivan Brown. So he not only talks about what they're doing, he actually points to who is in charge. It's, this is not conspiracy. This is the guy you want to keep an eye on.
Absolutely.
So
and
what
of course,
do you... Yeah, so... Go on.
He's correct. As you know, most of the things that he wrote about have now been confirmed by Susan Williams' book, White Malice, the CIA and the covert recolonization of Africa. It's confirmed that. It named some of the companies that Nkrumah said these were fake companies who were actually covers for CIA operations. She has confirmed that with documents that were subsequently released, you see? So, and if you notice, this memo, there's not a single sentence there that says Nkrumah makes these preposterous allegations.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, Nkrumah makes these outlandish allegations. You will never find a term like that in the memo you just wrote. In other words, they're not even saying anything he's saying is incorrect. Show me on that memo where they said anything he said was incorrect. That's the first thing I noticed. When I read, I said, wait, they're not saying, this African president is making preposterous allegations, false allegations. Boom. Not a single word contradicting what he said. And the fact that they highlighted, the things they highlighted, means they're basically saying, wow, the guy is on to us. He is on to us, He has really discovered, Otherwise they would not key on those particular items that he wrote about in the entire book. After all, the memo is only 4 pages. It's only 4 pages, but he selected a couple of issues. Then Nkrumah was correct. So they selected the Peace Corps as well, which means Nkrumah was correct.
I was coming to that.
For spies, you don't have to be incompetent and completely negligent if you are the United States and you're not using the Peace Corps for spying. There would have to be something wrong with you. Why would you not? It doesn't have to be each and every member. Okay, so I noticed that's why they put an exclamation mark. Then Nkrumah said the CIA, I don't know the word they use, but screens. I think they use screens every member of the Peace Corps, and they put an exclamation mark after that. That one I'm reading as saying that's the only part of the memo where he was wrong, Nkrumah. Why? Because it's physically probably very challenging to screen each and every one of the people that went out to the Peace Corps. But you don't have to screen every one of them. And not every one of them has to be doing your job. Out of every 100, if you have 20, that should be sufficient. You can't say all of them should be a spy. Of course not. That would be too obvious. The language they use, the way they conduct themselves, the Ghanaians would catch up to that sooner or later. Right?
Of course. And
every one of them.
We have to So we also have to understand that what Nkrumah was doing here is that time that he was in president, all of these intelligence agencies share information.
Mm-hmm.
So for some of them would have been shared to him in confidence. The fact that he was willing to put it into book form meant he was not only doing the bidding of his country, but he was thinking ahead for the continent. So he was effectively saying, listen, these people have us on a leash, and
Right.
this is how they
I agree.
have us on a leash.
I agree. Yeah, you're correct. I agree. He was
So,
warning other African leaders as well.
mhm,
And that is why the U.S.
that you know this thing to be true. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's why the U.S. was very angry, as you know. The United States State Department wrote an official letter of protest against the book. Think about that.
Yeah.
A country protesting
Yeah.
because the leader of another sovereign independent country
writes a book.
wrote a book that they find critical. Number one. Number two, as you know, they canceled $25 million in so-called foreign aid. And the value of that today is about $250 million. So it's nothing to sneeze at for an African country, you see? And they canceled that as a result of the book, which shows you if the book was just useless, there's no way would they cancel what would today amount to $250 million. Can you imagine? I would be very proud of myself if I wrote a book that resulted in the United States canceling $250 million assistance to an African country today. You see? You know, and I would hope
that in itself
I
is a
would hope
smoking
everybody
gun.
would say, wait a minute, I want to read that book. I want to see what. Instead,
Yes, I mean, people should read it.
valuable book is not known by enough Africans. You see?
Yeah.
It is not known by enough Africans. Ask yourself, why was Gaddafi killed? Because he was trying to create an independent African currency. Why is an independent African currency so good for Africa and so threatening to the West? Those are the kind of questions and discussions we need to be having. How can we create that currency without jeopardizing the lives of African leaders? They need to do it together, collectively. You know, we have.
There is gone.
Right. I was just saying we have organizations that could be at the forefront of leading this charge. Why is the African Union in its annual meetings not just propose every year until you get enough members to commit to an African currency, right? Okay, now we have the BRICS.
Yes.
We have the BRICS, talking about the BRICS coming up with this new currency that is not beholden or dependent on the dollar. Forget about BRICS. A collective African currency would be much more powerful than the BRICS currency because we have all the resources.
Correct. Yeah.
You see? So we are praying to lesser God when we have a God that can really uplift us from our predicament. And that God is African unity. Really.
There's another part here where he goes into detail about the role of religious organizations on the African continent that he calls that the distraction. He says we are being distracted from the greater good that we can actually achieve instead of, chasing what we already have, as he puts it. And says Africans have to focus because I'm paraphrasing now, that we're like children, just chasing the next shiny thing. Whereas all we need, like you said, to prosper is beneath our feet. And sometimes we just have to dig it up.
Yeah.
The fact that you have a cartel, the diamond groups, I'm just mentioning some chapters now in the book, the diamond groups, where basically they can hold your diamond.
No, think about it. We were talking about De Beers, and De Beers is still in monopoly control today.
Exactly.
today. And he wrote this in
Exactly.
1965. He wrote that. He was talking about De Beers, and he named De Beers in the book. It's the same De Beers today that is still controlling the diamond.
The
Diamond
diamond industry.
global market and production. You see?
Can you imagine?
Yeah. You know
This
what?
is
It's
almost
very,
60 years.
comrade, it's very inspiring, right? To know that we produced an African leader who was able to leave us with a gift of this caliber in the terms of this book and his many other books, correct? But at the same time, it's very painfully frustrating to know that this blueprint has not been adequately taught, let alone being implemented, you see? So it's like a contradiction, the inspiration, but the despair at the same time. But we must not get disillusioned because always a generation of inspired leaders come forward. We produce a Sankara, very inspired. There are many potential leaders right now that are preparing themselves to launch themselves on the African scene, you see?
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the fact that he left us with so many gems. The Neo-Colonialism, the last stage of imperialism, is just one of them.
Exactly.
Another would be Africa Must Unite.
Yep.
The perennial problem of Congo. He goes in depth into it in The Challenge of the Congo. Yep. He talks about the class struggle in Africa.
Yes.
About how the elites.
Right. In fact, I just did that last week. We discussed that in one of my classes. Yes.
Okay, so the class struggle. And he talked about the fact that the struggle continues, whilst he was exiled from Ghana and he was in Conakry. He wrote this, basically further highlighting his ideas of how the African continent can move on. But it's also important to mention that when we started, we said the book was published in London by Thomas Nelson and Sons. The book was initially supposed to be on Heinemann Press.
I see.
But was dropped.
Very interesting.
Yes.
What is the title
of the book? Was dropped.
Just held up.
It's titled Africa Writes Back.
Okay.
So the book was dropped. It's now, if you look at the various memos that emanated, including the one you mentioned with White Malice by Susan Williams' book, which is VAT. It's only now that you begin to understand the machinations behind the publishing industry, which is what I would like you to talk on, especially in light of your experience as well.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I knew you were probably going to say that. So I don't have a copy. In fact, it's so funny. I don't have a copy of my book, right? So hold up a copy of my book.
Yeah, okay. I do. That's my copy there.
Okay, very good. In fact, I visited a friend last week who had just come back from Ethiopia, and he brought some shirts for me because I had asked for him to grab me some shirts. So I went to collect them. And on his bookshelf, I was looking longingly at a copy of my book. I don't have a copy. So this book, when it came out, my book, was it 3 years now? Going on 4? The book was doing well, right? And then at some point, I think I explained this in one of our previous programs. I'm not getting any royalty checks anymore, right? It was very funny. And even you yourself and many other people started getting in touch with me. They would order the book and it would take such a long time. In one case, somebody told me even 6 months they were still waiting for that. You see? So now my own publisher is now undermining my book. You see? So as a result, I totally stopped cooperating with them. They wanted me to pay them like, $3,000 to get my copyright back. And, finally, was it 3 weeks ago? And then I told them, that I was going to get legal involved, and they agreed to give me my copyright back. So obviously, then I can make the book widely available, you see?
Available.
But
Yeah.
now you can understand why it would be difficult to publish a book of this caliber, you see?
Yeah.
Because the American market is a huge market. Why was this book never published in the United States? Think about that. It would have been easier for Americans to get it from a U.S. publisher, right? And the marketing,
Yeah.
especially if an American publisher hears that the United States wrote a letter protesting about the cancel what is today $250 million in assistance. Don't you think a U.S. publisher would want that book? The marketing potential for a book like that after those actions by the U.S. government, it would just sell itself. Even then, it never got an American publisher. That should tell you something. That sometimes, yes, they'll do anything for money, but sometimes they won't. And I'm sure it must have had something to do with some level of government intervention as well. Some level of government intervention for an American publisher not to want to publish that book and just bring in the money. Then, of course, they would invoke national security. And they would show them that memo that you read. If you get the whole CIA writing a review about a book, then, of course, they can invoke national security. And that would prevent the publisher who just wants to make money from publishing a book like that. That's what I can think of. I don't have the evidence, but logically, something happened to prevent an American publisher from making that money from that book. And it can only be explained by intervention from somebody who's powerful enough to prevent a publisher from wanting to make the money.
And there is a couple of questions in the chat. I'll run through a couple of them. So one is, what would be the response to neocolonialism in our present day Africa? That's one. Two is, what do we do about the educational system? And three is, more importantly, what is stopping African continents from rolling out that currency that we've talked about earlier? So it's education, the currency, and the entire apparatus of neocolonialism. How do we counter it?
Okay, so more and more African leaders are now talking about a United States of Africa, right? They're still just talking.
Okay, yeah.
We're encouraged when we see, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, coming around with collective statements, collective positions on a lot of issues. So we need to see more of that. And a lot of that is being driven by the youth, right? And you can see that in conversations on social media, right? And diaspora Africans as well, including sisters and brothers in the United States and the Caribbean, Brazil, all talking about African unity. So with the issue of currency, we have to tie that in and see it as something that needs to go together. So whenever we talk about the need for United States of Africa, we should link it with the need for independent African currency as well. And that's how we can push the conversation so that the leadership become aware that this is what the people want. So that would be my suggestions in terms of how we can get to that currency. But we need to get to that currency. It would facilitate unity, and the unity also facilitates the currency. In terms of education, we need to have more of these types of conversation on social media on the importance of education that empowers Africans, education that embraces the teachings of Nkrumah, the teachings of Walter Rodney, the teachings of Cabral, teachings of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, so many of our brave intellectuals, teachings of Frantz Fanon, teachings of C.L.R. James, the teachings of Steve Biko, who almost individually was able to uplift the consciousness of the African youth in South Africa. With this book, I know you have a copy. I write what I like. That book was very uplifting for the conscience of Africans. So we need to do that. And eventually, we need to also tie it in the same thing that I just said, the suggestions. When we're pushing for African leaders to adopt unity to adopt currency, to also embrace Afri-centric Pan-African education. Education that empowers Africans, that promotes a sense of pride and dignity. Education that teaches Africans that they cannot ever be inferior to anybody, because all other human beings, first of all, they were what is now called Africans. Before any other so-called races sprang from Africans. You see, basic knowledge is not even known by enough people. That at least 150,000 years ago, there was no other so-called race. There were only people that looked like us. And after whether it's 150,000 or 200,000 years ago, once they started spreading to other parts of the world, then over a period of 30 to 40,000 years, they adapted to the environment, to the climate, This is not challenged anymore. This is accepted even by Europeans. That is how Europeans came into being, how Asians came into being.
Yeah.
Any other so-called race, and I say so-called because genetically we are all the same. Only the features change to adapt to the new environment. And Africans need to know, because when this knowledge when I teach my college students that, the transformation is tremendous, to know that you actually are part of the core of human existence. Then all the propaganda about, black unachievement, black criminality, black lack of intelligence, all of that, you now realize is propaganda and all nonsense, you see? So education is very critical. So I agree with the person that posed that question,
Okay. That said, we've come to the end of this week's episode, and we just
No, but I have to say one more thing.
Go on.
The book is worth it. Believe me, the book is worth it. Put a few dollars aside and get a copy of this book, whatever you order it from, whether it's from Abbey Book, whether it's from Amazon, whether it's from whatever else you get your books. Get this book, and then when you come back in a few weeks after reading it, you can post your comment on this platform.
Yes.
And you
leave your comments
you
below.
will probably agree that it was money well spent. So I have to say that.
Yeah. Please leave your comments below. And if you have any questions, I would take some of them, and the ones that are way too beyond my scope, I would pass on to Comrade Milton.
Everything is your scope, man.
Yeah. Kwame Nkrumah was unique as a leader. Unique in the sense that not only did he put his thoughts forward, he also wrote them down.
Yeah.
The brother wrote at least 14 books and 6 pamphlets. 14 books. To think you were running a country and keeping score of everything around you, and you were able to document it, is a truly astounding feature for any leader, more so an African leader at that time. So, incidentally, marked 59 years short of a day that he was overthrown, because he was overthrown February 24, 1966. He went to China to help solve the problem with the Vietnam War, and that's when he was overthrown. Again, it goes back to this notion that as much as we believe in the humanity of others, our humanity is constantly being questioned. Please read Kwame Nkrumah's Neo-Colonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. Form your own opinions. I mean, the facts are out there. You can tie it to all contemporary times. Every chapter, and there are 18 of them, you would see common contemporary examples that highlight what he's talking about. It's no given. It's like reading Brother Rodney's book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. You will still see living examples, So, yeah, please do. And Brother Milton, any last words?
Continua. I am very happy that I'm living in a time where, as an African, I think I can offer some contribution in terms of ideas, in terms of how we can improve the living conditions of Africans. So I feel privileged to be living in that time. And I ask other sisters and brothers, never despair. Never despair. The challenges and problems are meant to be tackled. So rather than being despair, you should offer your own contributions and suggestions into terms of how we can meet these challenges head on.
Yes. And speaking of contributions, I can't go but thank patrons and the people who have been doing super chats. That has helped. It helps to keep this channel alive. We pay subscription to audio platforms, and that goes a long way to us doing that. Thank you very much. And until next week, when we continue with African News Review, it is good night and God bless. And thank you for coming through. Bye-bye. That's a wrap for this week on the African News Review podcast. We hope you are leaving with a clearer, more truthful picture of Africa. Remember, every story has another side, and we're here to uncover it. Don't forget to join us next Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern as we continue to challenge the narratives and reclaim Africa's voice. If you've enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep seeing Africa for what it truly is.